About you guys, but I like the new intro. It's a nice little like funky beat, gets me into a pretty good mood before we start the show. At least, I don't know, one man's opinion. Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast for Bama 24/7. I'm Cody Goodwin. It is now August 5th, Monday, another week of fall camp on tap. We're 4 practices down, still another month or so to go. We're only going to watch so many more practices moving forward. But to start off today's show, figured we could touch on some other quick hitters from the last couple of days of fall camp. We last talked on Friday, kind of recap the first couple of days, what we saw, what we heard, what we learned. Figured it would be good to start today's show with a few other things that maybe we saw and we heard and we learned. But first, guys, how we doing now? We're 4 practices over the last 5 days. Are we holding up okay? Are we working our way into game shape? How we feeling?
Oh, you're the one who was there yesterday. So, I was mowing my lawn. I'm in game shape mowing my lawn. You know, lawn doesn't mow itself. Doesn't matter if it's fall camp, middle of the summer, spring camp, preseason camp, training camp, whatever you want to call it. The lawn does not mow itself. So someone has to do it.
So Rodak's in lawn mowing game shape. Alec, how are you doing?
Well, I'm getting into lawn mowing game shape for about an hour from now or whenever we wrap this up. We're off day, but then they what do they go 6 straight days of practice after this? So it's we're getting in gear, right?
Yeah, they got the scrimmage on Saturday. Saturday the 10th. So yeah, it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I would imagine that Sunday fan day practice for anybody planning on going the day after a scrimmage, they're not going to be doing much, especially with a crowd of people in front of them. Like they're not going to be, running XY banana split, left Z out, to show everybody. It's going to be probably a walkthrough type of deal, I would imagine.
Run the triple option, just throw everybody off.
Yeah.
Somebody's been playing the new college football game, if that's what you're suggesting.
No, I'm thinking of John Gruden, that famous John Gruden clip from like 20 years
ago. 2 wide banana.
Yeah, with Chris Sims, I think it was.
John Gruden was at Chiefs camp the other day. Not that we need to dive into NFL training camp stuff, but I noticed that, and I was just like, I wonder what's going on there. He was decked out in red and everything. It was really interesting.
Well, they have a history, right? Gruden and Andy Reid, they coach with the Packers, I want to say.
I believe so. You might have to fact check me on that.
Yeah, Packers in the 90s.
There you go. We are going to discuss the couple of things that we saw, heard, learned from the last 2 fall camp practices. Not a ton more maybe than what we learned from the first couple, but a couple of small things here and there that I thought were interesting. I'll kind of do an around the horn style with some of the topics from the last couple of days with these guys. And then we're going to get into a larger discussion that I'm very excited to have, but that'll be in the latter half of the show. We'll start here. Couple of things that we learned from the last couple days of fall camp. Throw it to you, Mike, first. It sounds like more and more Zabian Brown, and maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent, Jalen Mbakwe, the 2 of the 3 5-star freshman cornerbacks. I think we all maybe thought that these guys would play or at least battle for significant snaps in their first year. Seems like these guys could play pretty quickly, especially Zabian Brown. And the quote from DeBoer was that this guy just does not look like a freshman when he's out there. That's kind of like, oh, antennas are up. Like, this guy may not just be playing a lot. I think there's a very real chance this dude could be the starter week 1. What do you think?
Right. It kind of reminds me of Saban last year with Caleb Downs and Justice Haynes. Remember back in the spring last year, he said if you were just a guy sitting on a log, I don't think you were here in the spring. I think that was his quote. If you're sitting on a log, just watching him, you wouldn't think he was a freshman, is what he said of Downs and Haynes. So same thing would apply. In that case, Downs certainly lived up to it. I think Haynes got hurt in fall camp and never really got the chance. So, you want to, I think as a coach, be cautious about how much you're putting out there about a freshman this early. But between the spring and, the first 4 days of fall camp, I think there's a lot of evidence that he's going to be the guy, which 2 weeks ago, we're talking about the cornerback position being a big competition, a big unknown. I don't want to say it's settled, but right now, would anybody be, shocked if it was Damani Jones and Xavier Brown? No, I think that's what the expectation is now. I think just reading between the lines with Deshaun Jones, like it doesn't seem like they were really necessarily bringing him in to like be the guy. Just from what I asked Kalen DeBoer the other day, and just didn't get the strongest answer about Deshaun Jones. It just seemed like they're bringing him in for his experience, the fact that he has the the D1 snaps. I think is kind of the way that DeBoer put it, but right now, I think Xavier Brown, with his talent level, and as we talked about on the last show, played a very, very high level of college football at modern day, has that learning curve being pretty small. You can step right in. And I agree. Mbakwe does seem like the number 2 guy in terms of those 3 freshmen, like where he's at in terms of being able to get on the field. You don't hear as much about Zay Mincy, but he's also the bigger guy, and maybe there's a role for him kind of in a different part of the secondary going forward. But they also have Red Morgan, who could do a lot of that stuff, and he's impressed as well. So I mean, right now, I don't declare the competition over, but I think Damani Jackson and Xavier Brown are your 2 guys there.
Alex, what do you? I know that we've maybe talked a little bit about how not ideal to have to play freshmen or younger, inexperienced guys in the secondary from the get-go. But I don't know. I always subscribe to the theory that if coaches feel good, I tend to feel good as well. These guys are a lot smarter than me. They obviously see a lot more than us. How do you feel about the idea that perhaps Xavier Brown could be starting week 1 against Western Kentucky?
Yeah, I mean, I don't hate the ideas. I mean, it's not like you have a better option, really. I mean, that's the thing. You're only as good as your options are. And if Deshaun Jones had a year in the program, yeah, I'd say, you probably got to go with the guy who's more experienced. But again, the early part of the schedule does make it so if you want a freshman to go out there and take some licks and learn some things before you get to a game, Wisconsin or Georgia, that's possible. So it is trending heavily in Zabian's direction. And look, if he's earned it, he's earned it. If you're the best athlete out there, go play. And I think in some ways, what I'm wondering is, does that apply sooner rather than later to one Ryan Williams? Because the same hype machine is not slowing down to the point that I even tried to give Nick Sheridan an out and said, look, do you have to kind of remind yourself this is a 17-year-old and you should be in high school and maybe pump the brakes? And he's no. We don't spend any time thinking about that. This guy can play. Let's go. It's pretty indicative that guy's on a similar track as Xavier, that it's just a matter of time before he gets out on the field. The difference is, of course, that Xavier was around in the spring and Ryan was not.
Yeah, 100%. Another defensive development that I at least thought was interesting from the last couple of days. When asked what the most impressive group or most consistent group was through the first few fall camp practices, Kalen DeBoer came back and said defensive line. I don't know that that's a huge surprise, just given the number of bodies that maybe return and the level of talent, and we've really hashed all that out. But kind of interesting that of all the position groups that we've been talking about, Alex, I'll throw it back to you, that the D-line has maybe been the most impressive to the head coach so far. What do you think about that?
Yeah, not entirely surprising, right? Because everybody who's returning, and it is a decent bit of experience there too. It's not just a bunch of freshmen who are back from last year. It's guys like Keenan, guys like Otis back. Whenever you get a body like Jaheim Otis back, everything looks a little bit better up front. The question is, okay, they look good now, but they just put on pads. So as that starts to progress and they're going full bore, what do those battles look like up front? But it's nonetheless a positive development, because that is one of our biggest questions: is how is that unit going to perform? Can they get to the quarterback and really be disruptive up front, especially when we're talking about the issues that may present themselves at cornerback and on the back end of the defense?
Yeah, the word DeBoer specifically used was consistent. I know that this is a group that we've talked about that maybe has a pretty high floor, but we're kind of curious about how high of their ceiling is. I guess through that lens, Mike, what do you make of the defensive line maybe being DeBoer's, I guess the most impressive group to the head coach thus far through fall camp?
It's training camp. You're practicing against yourself. So there's always going to be an upside and a downside, as coaches like to say. If the offense looks good, it means defense is not looking so good, and vice versa. So I guess in this case, the defensive line is only as bad as the offensive line is good. And so if I was just reading what DeBoer said about the defensive line again, very active early on, with the run schemes they were putting in the offensive line. Then he said, I thought they did a good job against the run, continue to do a good job putting pressure on the quarterback consistently. They're just around and making the quarterback back there have to move around and have to make some plays, which if you're watching practice, you might say, hey, great for the defensive line. You might also say not great for the offensive line. So without seeing the context of were they blitzing, like what was going on, like what's the full picture here? Was an offensive tackle getting beat? Was guard getting beat? Like what was happening that was leading to that? It's hard to put the full picture together on our end. But yeah, I mean, you have a returning position coach. You have 6 returning players that are really the only ones that are, realistically going to play this year. Otis, Tim Smith, Tim Keenan, James Smith, Damon Payne, maybe one more after that. Those like
don't forget the Bandits on the defensive end, right?
Right. If you're counting, I would assume when he's talking about the defense line, he's probably counting the Bandits too. So Latham, Overton, who's out there again. So really the only guy who's new of that group is Overton. And even if you go down to Keeley and Jordan Renaud and Edric Hill and Hunter Osborne, it's a very experienced group in terms of they've been here before. So maybe that helps when you put the pads on, they're kind of ready to go. But we'll see. I don't know if like fans or us or anybody watching this team would sit here or expects to sit here in like October and say the defensive line is the strength of this team. Like I think it's good. But if we're sitting here in October saying like, that's the best part of this team, I think people would be a little bit surprised personally.
No, I think that's a fair assessment.
I do wonder how much the mixing and matching at tackle right now might be playing a role in that as well. And I'm also reminded of the fact that early in spring practice, the D-line was winning a lot, and then it flipped at the end. So things can change, but still, nonetheless, it's good to hear that group is doing well because it's a pretty decent question mark for us.
I'd like to think that the scrimmages will maybe tell us a little bit more, not just about the defensive line, but also the offensive line and just what the battle in the trenches ultimately look like and whether or not there's reason for worry one way or the other. Is it the D-line taking advantage of an offensive line that lacks chemistry, or will the offensive line be able to impose its will on a D-line that maybe doesn't have a high ceiling? That'll be an interesting conversation to have, once we get through the couple of scrimmages in the lead up to week 1. Mike, I'm going to throw this back to you. With a lot of talk about the receiver group and what the roles are going to look like, who the guys are going to be. We've obviously talked at length about Ryan Williams, but you wrote a story this week after talking to receivers coach Jamarcus Shepard about 5'10", 186-pound Mr. Reliable Cole Adams. I thought that was an interesting little takeaway from Shepard, a guy who's got some pretty extensive receiver experience, that he would give that glowing endorsement about a guy who really hasn't played a ton. I know he impressed on A-Day, but what would you make of that comment from Shep?
Well, he said he's 115 pounds is what Shep said. He says he throws it all in there. And, sliding him about 70 pounds there. But that was his point that, maybe it's a little bit cliche, but he said he plays the game the right way. The way it's supposed to be played was his quote. He has respect for the game. He's going to throw it all in there. He ain't no big body dude, but he's going to throw everything he got. All right. 115 pounds. Okay. Very consistent hands, knows what to do, when to do it, can rely on him in everything we do. So it was certainly high praise. It's not the first time, Shepard had a radio interview over the summer and he said a lot of good things, kind of not even asked about Cole Adams. He was just asked about the receivers in general. And on his own brought up Cole Adams in terms of guy who hasn't gotten enough, conversation. So look, it's the same thing we talked about last week. There's only so many snaps to go around at receiver, especially, hey, you read Kalen DeBoer yesterday or listen to Kalen DeBoer. He's talking about 2 tight ends. He mentioned 2 tight ends. You're playing 2 tight ends. You're probably playing only 2 receivers on the field unless you go empty. So you can have 8 different receivers that you like, because if you're only going to have 2 on the field, if you're playing 2 tights, who are those 2 going to be? And if it's 3rd and 3 and you need 4 yards, are you throwing it to Caleb Odom or are you throwing it to Cole Adams, who's 6 inches shorter, but can go over the middle of the field and be Mr. Reliable and throw his body in there and get that extra yard to get the first down? Julian Edelman, Wes Welker, whoever you want to mentioned as a slot receiver who fits that mold. That seems to be what Shepard's getting at. So, look, I think he's going to play. I don't know if we're talking about a guy who's going to be, top 3 on the team in catches, but I think he's going to be out there more than just garbage time against South Florida. And that's what coaches like, is a guy that can be reliable and they can rely on. Sometimes they like that more than the sort of the untapped raw talent that some other guys might have.
No, I think there's something to that. And Alex, I'm curious your thoughts. The idea of just being consistent, and especially for a position group where we aren't 110% sure what all the roles are going to be, but it seems like Cole Adams has carved out a spot for him, perhaps in the slot. And as the rest of the group kind of figures itself out, and as they kind of figure out what roles are, this could be a dude that just kind of steps in and, gets a few snaps here and there, which I think, be one pretty cool story, all things considered. But what did you make of maybe Shep's comments on Cole Adams and just his overall development?
Cautiously optimistic, because I think every program in the country has their Wes Welker type that they think is going to be the slot receiver who's shifty and gets open and fights for the extra yard and all those cliches.
Golden.
Yeah, every team, he's got reliable hands, all those things. The question is, can you reliably get open? Can you reliably make explosive plays? Can you reliably beat an SEC cornerback? It's one thing to be consistent in practice. It's another thing to get open and have the quarterback throw you the football. That we have to wait and see, because we have seen guys bubble up in 8A and never materialize. But given the lack of returning production at receiver in terms of like a dude who you just know is going to catch 40 balls, given that lack of there, yeah, he can play a role, certainly. It's just a question of, do you value what he brings to the table, or do you, like you said, a Caleb Odom who's a little bit more difficult for a defense to handle, or a Ryan Williams? Like, there's only be so many guys in this rotation. It's going to be very interesting to see how it gets narrowed down throughout the course of camp.
And we've seen that sort of tension over the years too. I mean, I think Nick Saban was a coach who very much came from, if I can't rely on you to do something, I'm not going to put you out there. I don't care how talented you are. If you're going to fumble the ball, if you're going to, drop a catch, if you're going to do whatever, I'm not playing you. If you don't know where to line up, if you're going to commit a penalty, doesn't matter if you run a 4.2 and you're 7 feet tall, like he's not going to put you out there. So, yeah, I don't know Kalen DeBoer well enough to know like kind of where he falls in that, but there could be a tension at a point in the season. If you're putting Robbie Utes and CJ Dupree out there because they're two seniors, they know what they're doing. Robbie Utes can block for you. CJ Dupree can block or do whatever for you. You're protecting a tackle, maybe. You're putting Jeremy Bernard out there because I think you rely on him in the system. And then you have some other receiver out there, Kendrick Law or Cole Adams or whoever. And there might be, it might not be the most explosive offense with those guys on the field. And it's funny too, because I was reading DeBoer yesterday about the tight ends, and he says they can help us in protection. They're guys that can stretch the field and make some big plays that way. Having a guy that just doesn't control the middle of the field but can get vertical, stress you to the sideline. So vertical and horizontal stretch is what he wants out of his tight ends. I don't know if they have that guy.
Yeah.
I mean, CJ Dupree had that one long catch down the seam against South Florida from Ty Simpson last year. He had that catch against Kentucky from Milrow, I think was more of a catch and run. Cuevas had a couple big catches for Washington. That's about all he had. And, Robbie Utes had that 40-yard catch it was Bill O'Brien who drew it up 3 years ago, maybe, down the left side there against one of those teams. So the track record of the tight ends producing vertically has not really been there with the guys that they have, but maybe that's part of it. And again, there might be some tension where this offense is kind of stagnant because they're playing some of these reliable but less talented players. And you have fans sitting at home throwing things at their TV saying, why aren't they playing Caleb Odom more? Why aren't they playing Ryan Williams more? Why aren't they playing this guy more? And I think it comes down to, can the coaches trust you not to fumble the ball, not to mess up, not to commit a penalty, not to do the stupid things? That tension, I think, exists. I've seen it 15 years now covering football. That exists in a lot of different places.
I will say again, going back to the Ryan Williams hype train, that has been one pretty big consistency. They already do trust him.
Right.
I mean, they've talked about, look, one of the hardest things to do as a freshman is just know how to get lined up, and he's got that. He's got the understanding already. So, yeah, I think what you're saying is right. Trust is a big part of it. But if you're going to pick a position out on the football field that you can kind of weigh and counterbalance those kind of things, receiver's it, because your responsibility is a little bit less in terms of the whole offensive dynamic. So if you got a guy who can stretch the field vertically and make a safety go off of Jeremy or whoever it is, I think you got to put that guy on the field. And I think that's going to be, it may be the tension early. I don't know if it'll be the tension once it gets into games like Georgia, where you just got to have a better athlete on the field. Because if you don't, that defense is just going to lock you down.
I'm sorry. Is that Tyler Harrell calling me? Why am I not playing, Coach? Tyler Harrell experience, Cody. You missed that. That was 2 years ago.
It sounds like for the better.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about him on the field.
Yeah.
He didn't play. This guy was billed as like this track athlete who averaged like 40 yards a catch at Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, we need this guy to stretch the field. Even Saban was saying in fall camp, we need to put this guy on the field more. And I think they finally got him out there in like November. And I watched him, and he got on the field. He just ran straight down the field. Bryce Young looked somewhere else and threw it to somebody else. Tyler Harrell ran back to the line of scrimmage. Next play, he runs down the field again. Nobody looks at him. He comes back, comes out of the game, and that was it.
Just running wind sprints.
That's all he did.
That's
Stretch the field.
Two final thoughts. I guess like on the receivers and reliability and consistency and all that stuff. Shep also had a really good quote about, he doesn't. I mean, he more or less said that they haven't really learned anything about the receiver group yet, because they're basically working all the way back to the fundamentals to make sure that these guys can do a lot of the little things correctly that lead into the opportunity to do the big things, which I thought was really interesting. We've seen a little bit of that through fall camp, just in the moments that we've been able to see during practice, that they're running go routes. They're doing small things here and there, running routes against air, catching balls from quarterbacks who aren't facing a rush. But it is interesting to me that they are literally starting all the way back from scratch, from square one. And it's like, okay, like it's almost like Shep's doing that as if to say, show me that you can do a lot of these little things before I even put you in the game. And so it'll be kind of, I know we've talked a lot about roles and what it'll look like in the offense, but like it's clearly there's a process where these guys are having to earn it. And so I think that's what'll make the scrimmages really interesting. That'll obviously make what week one be really interesting, is who earned enough trust to finally get out there on the field and play. And that'll be super interesting about the receiver group. The other thing too about the idea of trust, relating Ryan Williams back to Xavier Brown, right? That was another thing that DeBoer said about Brown. I trust him a lot already, which is what leads me to believe that Brown could see the field early. It also leads me to the idea that Williams could see a lot of playing time, if not immediately, eventually this season, even as a true freshman. So sometimes parsing words through the interviews can teach you a few things here and there, which is kind of the fun part. Last thing I wanted to throw out here before we get to the fun conversation that I'm excited to have today. Jalen Milroe got to talk to us on Saturday after, I guess we got to talk to Jalen Milroe on Saturday after practice. And he hinted that he might already know who his go-to receiver is. He didn't name names, but he did say, like, I've got a couple of dudes in mind that will probably be ready by week one. Alex, I'll start with you. Who do we think that go-to receiver is?
I'm tempted to say it's Jeremy Bernard, because I think he has the highest upside of the group and what we saw out of A-Day. But I think it's probably Kendrick Law. I think he's been at the top of that list for a while. I think they have a long track record, and he's sure-handed. He's a guy who he's known for a long time he can trust. So I think because of that familiarity is probably why I'd say he's the guy. Do I think that will eventually change as we get into the course of the season? Maybe. But my first guess was that it's probably Law.
What do you think, Mike?
Not to be boring, but I have the exact same answer. I do think it's Kendrick Law. Those guys, they have been around together for a couple years now. I think they know each other pretty well. Law is really like the top returning guy, if you want to put it that way. There's also Kobe Prentice and Cole Adams, and Jalen Hale was hurt. But if you're talking about like trust and reliable, even though it's not Mr. Reliable, I think Kendrick Law is more than likely the guy that Milroe's talking about. Without having seen practice, and just because he says he's his go-to receiver doesn't mean that he's thrown to him 20 times during practice. Like you shouldn't like run away with that comment necessarily, but usually when a quarterback has that sort of guy, it's someone that they've been around for a while. So that's kind of where I'd lean on that one.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of those two guys. I think, guys like Kobe Prentice and Cole Adams and some of the freshmen probably a little further down on the list, but one of those two guys probably makes the most sense. Just one, Bernard knows the offense, and two, we've really heard nothing but great things about Kendrick Law since this new staff got installed. They've been enamored with just his raw physical ability. It seems like an offensive staff that is excited to plug Kendrick Law into the offense to see what they can do to take advantage of some of the special traits that he has. So one of those two, I think, makes the most sense. If it's anybody else, I think I would be very, very surprised. Although, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, just Kobe Prentice had some flashes last year, man, where he catches the ball and there's a little bit of explosivity there that I don't think enough people are maybe talking about. I'm not saying it's enough for him to be a go-to guy, but it would not surprise me if the staff found a way to utilize him out of the slot, because that's where he was just most effective last year. Not a ton of snaps, but when he was on the field, he tended to there was a little bit of a different, like when he got the ball, it was just exciting, I suppose. And so I wonder how this staff can maybe capture that a little bit more.
I'm glad that there's no fantasy football in college, because when a quarterback says something like that, like I've got my go-to guy, I'm not going to tell you, basically. Like when I was at ESPN, man, the Matthew Berrys of the world would have been all up and emailing me and texting me, like, who do you think he's talking about? We got to write about this. The story would have blown up. Who's the go-to guy? Fantasy people would have just eaten that alive. So I'm glad, for our sake, that there's no fantasy football in college, because a quote like that would just make my week miserable.
Instead, it is merely a podcast segment on Roll Pod. So,
yes,
we're doing what we can. Okay.